Kansas Territory, August 1873. The sky was the color of scorched almonds, and the dust off the trail clung to everything like shame. Keziah Monroe sat on the front porch of the homestead she had once helped build, her back pressed to the rail post, legs drawn up beneath her faded calico skirt. Her breath came short these days, every step a slow fight. The fever had passed weeks ago, but something deep in her chest still rattled when she coughed, and her strength had not returned. Her fingers trembled when she tried to snap beans, and her arms gave out before the wash was done. Inside, her husband slammed something heavy on the table. "Useless," he muttered. "What good is a wife who cannot even cook a meal or clean her own house?" Keziah closed her eyes. The word sank into her like a stone thrown in a well. She had borne his children, buried one, and fought by his side through locusts and drought. She had stitched this home together with her own hands, but now that her body was weak, he saw no use in her. "Your brother's wife never got sick," he said last week. "Some women are built to last." She said nothing. She had learned silence was safer. That evening, after he rode out to trade in town, Keziah limped to the barn to check on the children. 8-year-old Eliza sat in the hayloft, reading aloud to her little brother, Ezra, who was still only 5. The boy curled against her like a pup, eyes drooping. "Ma," Eliza said softly, "he called you a bad word again." "I know, baby." She knelt beside them, brushing Ezra's curls from his brow. "But you are safe, that is what matters." 3 days later, he left for good. Just saddled the mare, took the last of the coin, and rode off without a word. Left her with 2 children, a failing farm, and lungs like torn cloth. By the next morning, the well was near dry, and the bread sack held only a fistful of flour. She tried to chop firewood but collapsed in the yard, her breath wheezing out like steam from a cracked kettle. "You are still worth everything." The voice came from the fence line, low and rough like worn leather. She blinked up through the haze of pain and dust. A man stood there, tall and lean, sun-browned with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He climbed down from his horse, tied it to the post, and walked to her with slow, careful steps. "Keziah Monroe?" he asked. She nodded, too weak to speak. "I am Porter Whitlow. I passed your husband on the trail yesterday. He was bragging about leaving you behind, said he was finally free of deadweight." She winced. Porter crouched beside her, eyes searching hers like he was looking for something more than wounds. "I got no right bane here, but I could not ride on." "Your girl was out by the road, waving a white cloth. She looked scared." "Eliza," she whispered. "I am no doctor," he said, "but I know how to boil water, how to cook, and how to keep a farm from falling apart. Let me help." She shook her head weakly. "You do not know us. You owe us nothing. I owe decency to anyone left behind like that." He hesitated, then added, "You are not useless. You are still here. That counts for something." Her throat tightened. No one had spoken to her like that in months. He helped her up gently, one hand on her back, the other steadying her elbow. His touch was firm but respectful, like he knew the weight of broken things. Once inside, he settled her on a chair and knelt by the hearth, coaxing a fire with practiced hands. Eliza stood by the door, watching him with wide eyes. Ezra peeked from behind her skirts. "You got names, little ones?" Porter asked, soft as cotton. "I am Eliza. He is Ezra," she said. "Well, Eliza, Ezra," he said with a nod. "Let us make sure your mama gets strong again." That night, he cooked beans with salt pork, taught Eliza how to feed the fire without choking it, and told Ezra a story about a horse that could outrun the wind. The children smiled for the first time in days. Keziah watched from the rocker, her chest aching in ways that had nothing to do with her sickness. She had not asked for saving. But here he was, a stranger who had seen her collapse and chose to stay. When the children were asleep, he brought her tea made from wild mint. "You do not have to stay," she said, voice low. "I know," he said. "But I want to." She stared at him, trying to understand. "Why?" "Because I have seen enough men walk away from good women. I will not be one of them." She looked at his hand-scarred, calloused, honest. She looked at the way he had tucked the children in, the way he had spoken to her without pity. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe without fear. Keziah did not know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, in the soft glow of the fire, with her children safe and a man who looked at her like she still mattered, she felt something stir in her chest. not just pain. Hope. Porter's hands were black with soil by mid-morning. He'd cleared out the dead rows behind the house where the beans had withered, the stalks brittle as bone. There was no sense planting more just yet, not until the ground had water and the house had steadier meals, but it felt right to start cleaning what had been left to rot. Keziah watched him from the window, one hand pressed against the sill. Her breath still caught if she moved too fast, but the heaviness in her chest had eased in the night. Not healed, but loosened like a knot beginning to give. Inside, Eliza stood on a wooden stool, grinding cornmeal with slow, determined turns of the pestle. Ezra sat nearby, stacking pieces of kindling into cautious towers. Keziah stepped into the yard, steadying herself against the doorframe. Porter looked up, squinting against the sun. He didn't speak right away, but lifted his hat and wiped his brow with his sleeve. A single crow called from the far cottonwood. "You're working ground that won't feed you," she said. He straightened. "It's not about feeding me." "Then what is it about?" He rested his hand on the handle of the hoe. "I reckon it's about showing something still possible here." Keziah glanced at the barn, the smokehouse, the lean-to where the tools leaned rusting. "You don't seem like a man who stays put." "I ain't," he said, "but I've never seen a place more in need of someone who'll stay a while." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. She folded her arms beneath her shawl. "The roof leaks above the children's room, I saw. I've got some pitch and cedar shingles in my pack. Wasn't sure why I brought 'em. Guess I do now." She didn't answer. The wind stirred her skirts and she turned back toward the porch. He followed, but not too close. Later, while Ezra napped in the hayloft and Eliza sorted dried apples into jars, she brought Porter a basin and sat beside him on the porch rail. The sun slid lower, casting amber light across the land that had once been green. "You were headed somewhere when you met him," she said. "Where?" "Northwest. There's a cattle drive starting out of Dodge next month. Thought I might sign on. You still could." "I could," he said, "but I've ridden after money before, never got much from it besides a sore back and empty nights." She looked at him, really looked. His coat was worn but mended, the stitching tight. His boots were scuffed but tended. He'd been alone a long time, she could tell, but not wild from it, just quiet. "You've got people?" she asked. "My sister up in Fort Larned. She married a quartermaster. I write sometimes. She worries I'll die in a saloon brawl." "Will you?" "No," he said. "I leave before they get loud." The porch creaked beneath her bare feet. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, nothing could come undone. Most things worth keeping come loose anyway," he said, voice low. "But that don't mean they can't be mended." She studied the horizon. The air smelled of dust and iron, but also wood smoke and bread. "You should know," she said after a long pause. "I don't trust easy anymore. I don't expect you to, and I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. I don't aim to." He leaned back on his heels, arms resting on his knees. "I'm just here," he said. "And if Bane here helps, I'll stay." The last of the sun dipped behind the ridge and the light softened. She didn't speak again, but she didn't move away either. They sat there until the stars came out and nothing more was said, but something had shifted, something quiet but sure. Like the brace of a beam set true after a long season of sagging, inside the children slept. Outside, the wind carried only the sound of insects and the slow creak of the porch swing. He was still there in the morning, and she was glad of it. The rain came on a Tuesday, sudden and hard. It ran in thin sheets off the eaves and pooled in the dry garden rows, softening the earth Porter had turned days before. Keziah stood at the barn door with one hand resting against the frame, watching the drops gather and fall from the fence rails like beads on a string. The air smelled like damp mesquite and iron, cleaner than it had in months. Porter was inside, checking the roof beams above the loft. Eliza sat cross-legged near the stall, brushing stray hay from Ezra's curls as he played with a carved wooden calf Porter had whittled that morning. "You ever build something like this before?" Keziah asked, her voice carrying softly through the barn. Porter looked down from the loft, his hat pushed back on his head. "A few sheds, a smokehouse once. Nothing as fine as this, but I can mend what needs holding together." She stepped further in, her boots darkening with mud near the threshold. "We built it in the spring after Eliza was born. He wanted it tall enough for 2 horses, but we never had more than one." He didn't press her further. She was grateful for that. The silence between them didn't stretch uncomfortably, it settled. Ezra stood and held out the wooden calf. "It don't got a tail." Porter climbed down and squatted beside him. "Well, I reckon that means it's still growing. You can help me finish it later." Ezra nodded and returned to his spot beside Eliza, who gave Porter a quick glance before returning to her quiet sorting. Back at the house, Keziah stirred the pot on the stove without needing to brace herself first. The tea Porter had brewed from dried yarrow and horehound had kept the worst of the coughing at bay the last 2 nights. Her legs still ached, but walking didn't feel like a punishment anymore. Porter came in behind her, bringing the scent of wet leather and cedar. He closed the door softly, then took up a cloth and wiped down the table without being asked. "You've been here 5 days," she said. "Most men wouldn't have stayed past the first." "I never liked most men," he said, rinsing the rag in the basin. "I've seen what leaving does. It don't sit right." She ladled stew into the bowls. "You're not from Kansas, Texas Panhandle, south of Canadian River. My father ran cattle till the fever took him." "How old were you?" 17. "My brother tried to run the herd after him, but he drank near as much as he rode. I left before I buried another." She passed him a bowl, careful not to let their fingers brush. "You've been alone a long time." He didn't deny it. "Long enough to know when it's time to stop." They ate in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of spoons and the murmur of the rain against the window glass. When the children were tucked in, Keziah stayed by the hearth, her shawl drawn close with one hand and a book open on her lap. She hadn't read aloud in months. Her voice wasn't strong enough for stories yet, but she traced the words with her eyes as if they might steady her. Porter sat across from her, mending a split in the heel of Ezra's boot. "I saw him strike a mule once," she said, without lifting her eyes from the page, "for stumbling on loose stone. He said it was a lesson." Porter didn't look up. "Some men teach from fear because they don't know how to earn respect. He never hit me, not with his hands. But there are other ways to make a person feel smaller than they are. You don't feel small now." She folded the book closed and looked at him. "No, I don't." He set down the boot. "You're stronger than any woman I've met." She rose and crossed the room slowly, not out of weakness this time, but with the kind of care that came from knowing her own worth again. She stood before him, the firelight painting her face in soft gold. "I don't know what this is," she said. "But I know I don't want to lose it." "You won't," he said, his voice roughened by something deeper than weariness. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She reached out and touched his hand. It was rough and warm and still. "I'm not looking for someone to fix me," she said. "I'm looking to stand beside you, not in front." She nodded once, slow and sure, then turned back toward the hearth. Porter rose and followed, not close, not pressing, just near enough to share the light. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. Inside, the quiet held something whole. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time in a long while, Keziah felt the ground beneath her was her own again. The morning broke cold for June, sky pale as skim milk with a wind that smelled faintly of river sedge. Keziah stepped into the yard with a woven basket hooked over one arm, her shawl pinned tight. The ground still held dampness from the rains days before, but the rows Porter had cleared were firm underfoot, the furrows now lined with green shoots radish, onion, and a few hills of squash. She bent to pull a weed, slow and steady, her breath even. Behind her, the door creaked open. Porter came out carrying a crate of nails and a narrow-handled saw. He nodded toward the north corner of the barn where the boards had begun to split from wind and weather. "I'll brace that wall before it leans too far," he said. "You've got a wedge in the shed, in the barrel beside the drawknife." She straightened, brushing dirt from her palms. "I meant to fix it last fall, but the days got short. I'll make that a proper bench when I'm done." No sense leaning tools against the wall like kindling. She tilted her head. "You always this particular about other folks' barns, only the ones I plan to keep using." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, but she didn't answer. There was no need. That afternoon, while the children helped gather the last of the eggs from the coop, Keziah walked the edge of the property, past the cottonwoods and toward the creek. Porter joined her without a word, his rifle slung across his back, not for show but in quiet watchfulness. The water was low but still moving, glinting in the sun like a strip of hammered tin. She knelt and dipped her hand into the current, letting the chill bite her skin. "Used to bring Eliza here to cool off," she said. She'd strip down and splash until her teeth chattered. "Looks like a good place for a rope swing," he said, pointing to the thickest limb stretching over the bank. She smiled, small and tired but real. "If you can lift Ezra high enough, I'll allow it." They sat together on a fallen log, the bark worn smooth with age. Neither of them spoke for a while. The quiet between them had grown easy, like the hush before a rain that nourishes instead of drowns. He finally said, "The folks who took me in after my father passed, they were farmers, Mennonite, not a word wasted in that house, but when they prayed it was always out loud, like they wanted the sky to hear them." She glanced at him. "You ever pray out loud?" "Not since I left their land. But I've been thinking on it again." She looked down at her hands, nails dirt-lined, palms scarred from years of rope and kettle handles. "I used to ask for strength, then I started asking for silence, just one day where nothing broke." He nodded. Now I think I'd ask for more time, not years. Just days that don't feel like climbing uphill with wet boots." He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The warmth of his presence was enough. When they returned to the house, the children were asleep beneath a patched quilt on the parlor rug. The rain had driven them in early. Their cheeks were flushed, limbs tangled like pups. Porter stepped around them careful as a man crossing thin ice. Keziah set the kettle on the stove and stirred the embers. "You ever miss riding?" "Sometimes, but I never liked leaving more than I liked staying. I just never had reason to stop before." She leaned against the counter. "You think this is a place worth stopping for?" He met her eyes then, calm and steady. "I do." The kettle began to hiss. She moved to lift it, but he was already there, wrapping a cloth around the handle and pouring for both of them. She took her cup and held it close, the steam curling against her cheek. "I've got land that needs tending, children that need raising, and a roof that leaks every time the wind shifts. I don't have much else to offer." "I didn't come here for what you could offer," he said. "I came because I saw a woman still standing when most others would have folded." She looked at him then, really looked not as the man who arrived dusty and quiet with no promise of staying, but as someone who had already begun to root himself in the corners of her days. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you," he said. "But you're what I want." The fire cracked softly, and outside the wind stilled. Something settled between them, firm as a stone set in good earth. She didn't answer right away. She only stepped close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. By July, the fence line was mended, the squash leaves were broad enough to shade the dirt, and Keziah's breathing no longer rasped in the quiet hours before dawn. The wind had shifted warmer, and the creek ran steadier with the summer melt from the Flint Hills. The house no longer felt like a place she was surviving in. It felt like something she could call hers again. Porter had stayed. Not with words, but with action, tightening the hinges on the barn door, showing Eliza how to read the clouds, teaching Ezra how to hold a hammer without splitting his thumb. He moved through the days with the same quiet steadiness he'd brought with him, but the edges of his solitude had softened. He laughed now, low and rare, but real. One morning, after Ezra had gone off with Eliza to gather more gooseberries, Keziah found Porter near the shed, cutting lengths of rope. She stepped up beside him and leaned on the doorframe. "You going somewhere?" she asked. He looked up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Actually, I was macking a halter for that colt you've got in the back paddock. He's just about ready for training." She nodded. "I'd forgotten he was even old enough. You've had your hands full." Keziah bent to pick up one of the coils he'd finished. "This is good work. You've done more around here in 2 months than..." She stopped herself. "Well, it's good work." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "You've never asked what I really want." She held the rope loosely in her hands. "Maybe I've been afraid to hear it. I want to stay, not just through the planting, not just till the colts broke." He stepped closer, the space between them drawing down to a breath. "I want this, you, the children. The work and the quiet and the days that feel like they matter." Keziah didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the field where the breeze stirred the new corn. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I want someone who knows how to stay, not because he has to. Because he chooses to." I choose to. She looked back at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. He was sunburnt and threadbare and standing in sawdust, and she had never seen anyone look more certain. I don't want a wedding dress, she said. I don't care about paper, but I want you under this roof. I want you to teach Ezra how to whittle and sit beside Eliza when she gets her first heartbreak, and I want to wake up knowing I don't have to carry the weight alone. You won't, he said. Not ever again. She stepped forward and he met her in the middle. His hand found the side of her face, rough thumb brushing the hollow beneath her cheekbone. She didn't flinch. Not this time. The kiss was quiet, not rushed, not uncertain. Just two people who had come through the worst and found something still worth building. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the front step and watched the lightning bugs rise over the grass. She leaned against him, her head tucked beneath his chin, and his arm curled around her waist like he'd always meant it to be there. You sure you're not gonna miss chasing cattle across dust plains? She asked, voice teasing. I've chased enough things, he said. I'd rather build something that stays put. She smiled into his shoulder. Then you're in the right place. In the months that followed, the house changed in quiet ways. Porter and Keziah added a second row to the garden, then a chicken pen near the edge of the pasture. The children learned how to read the almanac and how to patch their own clothes. The land didn't give everything, but it gave enough. In early spring, Keziah woke one morning to the sound of Porter splitting kindling in the yard. She lay in bed for a moment, the quilt warm around her, the smell of coffee drifting in from the stove. Eliza's laughter floated in from outside. Later, when they walked the field together, she took his hand, fingers laced firm. I didn't think I'd get another chance, she said. Sometimes the good things come later than they should, he replied, but they still come. He kissed the side of her head and she leaned into him without hesitation, no fear, no doubt. Just the weight of love earned, not promised, not given freely, but built, day by day, like the home around them. They married in the fall, under the same cottonwood where the children had first learned to climb. Ezra wore a vest Porter had stitched from an old feed sack, and Eliza stood beside her mother with her hair braided back with wildflowers. No preacher, no fanfare, just two people speaking vows over the land they'd tended, with the children between them and the creek running full behind. They lived the rest of their days in that house, never rich, never easy, but steady. Porter taught Ezra to ride, and Eliza grew into a woman with her mother's grit and her own quiet fire. Keziah's cough never returned. She kept the shawl, though. Some things held memory. She and Porter grew old together, their backs bending with the work, but their hearts never once turning away. And every night when the lamps were out and the wind quieted against the windows, he would reach for her hand beneath the quilts. She would find it every time and hold on.